Bat 9:17 a.m. on December 7, 1941, on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, Commander Minoru Genda stood with binoculars raised, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft disappear into the southern horizon. The engines faded into distance, the contrails thinning against the morning sky. The light was clean, brittle, sharp. The Pacific rolled below like polished steel. In that moment, there was still absolute faith, absolute clarity, absolute confidence. Genda had spent 11 months refining this strike. Not drafting, refining. There is a difference. Drafting is theory. Refining is obsession. He had lived inside this plan. His staff said he could recite the Oahu target grid in his sleep. They joked that he could draw Ford Island without opening his eyes. He could identify American destroyers by silhouette the way an artist identifies brushstrokes. He had studied American fleet behavior until he could predict launch tempi by instinct. He believed he knew his enemy down to individual characteristics, and he truly believed he had left nothing to chance, nothing to uncertainty, nothing to human error. He knew American battleship numbers. He knew American carrier displacement values. He knew American anti-aircraft layout on main battery turrets. He knew which magazines were below waterline and which were vulnerable to plunging fire. He believed he knew everything that mattered. But there was one number, one single number, and that was wrong. Not by 20%, not by 40%, not by 100%. Wrong by a factor of 7. That number was not in ships. That number was not in aircraft. That number was not in gun elevation or turret rotation or deck armor penetration coefficients. That number was people. The Japanese High Command estimated that by December 1943, the United States Navy would have 13,070 officers, 296,000 enlisted men that seemed reasonable within Japanese worldview, logical within Japanese institutional development, sensible within Japanese naval history. The actual numbers were 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, 2,034, 343 enlisted. Japan had miscalculated not by 20 or 30%, but by over 7 to 1. This was not a rounding error. This was not fog of war. This was not minor deviation. This was a strategic miscalculation so catastrophic that it would shape every battle from Pearl Harbor to the Philippine Sea. It would determine not only how the war began, it would determine how the war could never end on Japanese terms. Because Japan believed it was fighting a war of ships. But the United States was a nation that fought wars with systems, not platforms. The first man who noticed a crack in the numbers was Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa. Yoshikawa was not meant to be an intelligence officer. He was meant to fly. He had been a promising young aviator, aggressive, talented, technically sharp, until a stomach illness ended his flying career in 1936. His Air Wing classmates went on to become combat group leaders and formation instructors. He was told he would never return to cockpit status. Japan didn't waste him, but they mispurposed him. He was transferred to naval intelligence. There, his memory, his analytical precision, and his ability to retain visual data made him unusually valuable. He could stare at a photograph once and then sketch details hours later with near mechanical fidelity. On March 27, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Yoshikawa was sent to Honolulu under diplomatic cover using the civilian alias Tadashi Morimura. His mission was simple: observe, record, report. But he was not guessing from the distance. He was hands-on. He took the tourist boat that toured Pearl Harbor. He walked the docks as a curious civilian. He rented private aircraft to make sightseeing, flights, and silently photographed facilities from above. He listened to naval traffic. He memorized patrol patterns. He marked where cruisers berthed on weekdays versus Sundays. His reports back to Tokyo were astonishingly detailed. The problem wasn't what he saw. The problem was how Tokyo interpreted what he saw. Yoshikawa counted American ships. Tokyo counted American ships. That part was correct. Yoshikawa saw carrier decks. Tokyo estimated crew complements. That part was correct. But Tokyo used Japanese manning standards as baseline. That part was fatal. Japanese warships were manned lean, extremely lean, by doctrine. Japan believed efficiency meant minimum personnel. Their warships were manned hard, with high workload density, long hours, and specialist crews filling 2 and sometimes 3 overlapping roles. The Japanese assumed the Americans did the same. They assumed American ships were staffed like Japanese ships. They assumed American logistics crews would be similarly minimal. They assumed American carriers had roughly 2,500 men. They assumed, and assumption is the most dangerous drug in war. To understand how Japan could make this mistake, you must understand something deeper. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not consider intelligence a primary weapon. Operations mattered more than analysis. Aggressive action was valued more than cautious understanding. The glamorous career path was flying fighters off carriers, or commanding cruisers, not sitting behind a desk analyzing enemy shipbuilding reports. Ambitious officers avoided intelligence assignments. Intelligence was not a prestige track. It was a side branch. It was a cul-de-sac. This meant the Japanese Navy was structurally incapable of challenging its own assumptions. Mirror imaging, the worst cognitive trap in analysis, became institutional culture. They did not ask, "What is America capable of?" They asked, "What would we be capable of if we were America?" This distinction sounds small. It was everything. Japan assumed that American naval expansion would resemble Japanese naval expansion. Gradual, methodical, paced, careful, conservative. And so, even though Japanese attachés in Washington had access to American data, even though Japanese officers were reading trade journals that literally printed American yard output, even though commercial shipbuilding statistics were available in open publications, Tokyo's intelligence system filtered all of it through a Japanese lens. And a Japanese lens made American numbers seem impossible. Japan could not imagine a nation recruiting sailors by the tens of thousands per month. Japan could not imagine a boot camp that could process 4,000 recruits at once. Japan could not imagine training systems that could convert civilians into effective sailors in 8 weeks, because in the Japanese worldview, quality required years, cohesion required years, mastery required years. Japan believed naval skill was earned slowly, carefully, not mass-generated by system, by factory, by industrialized pedagogy. They could not imagine a nation that could do with 90 days what Japan required 900 days to do. In June 1941, the United States Navy had roughly 284,000 personnel. 18 months later, December 1942, the U.S. Navy had $1,640,000. That is not growth. That is detonation. By December 1943, the moment Japan believed America would finally peak, the U.S. Navy had 2.37 million uniformed personnel. Japan had assumed $300,000. They were wrong by 2 million men. 2 million is not a number. 2 million is a force of nature. The first warning came at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese reconnaissance said, 2 American carriers present, 2 Japanese carriers. Roughly 4,000 crew total. Radio intercepts indicated multiple task group commanders and logistical footprint far larger than 4,000 worth of personnel would suggest. The Japanese analysts could not reconcile it. They assumed the Americans were simply overstaffed because they were inexperienced. This error was shrugged off, then Midway, then Guadalcanal. Each time, evidence was screaming that American manpower was orders of magnitude beyond projections. Each time, Tokyo's analysts flinched from the psychological cost of accepting it, because to accept it meant admitting that the war plan was built on false math. The moment of cognitive stress peaked after Midway when they examined the Yorktown. The Yorktown was hit. It should have died. It didn't. Because the Americans had redundancy built into crew complements, massive damage control teams, layered specialists, overlapping disciplines, multiple backups. This level of redundancy was not a luxury. It was manpower density. Japan could not believe the number of bodies the Americans had available aboard one ship. When they retrieved personnel data floating in the water, the Yorktown had over 2,200 crew. Japan had assumed $1,500. That difference was everything. Because crew koinan capability, manpower maunang operations rate, bodies, and sustained tempo. Japan wasn't fighting parity. Japan was fighting mass. At Guadalcanal, Japan believed the Americans could land maybe 8,000, 10,000 men. The actual landing force on Guadalcanal alone was 11,000, plus Tulagi, plus equipment, plus supply chain, plus merchant marine crews, plus support, plus carriers, plus screening forces, plus logistics tail. And those forces were not stretched thin. They were not last resort. That was just one theater. Simultaneously, America was running Atlantic convoy escort, North African operations, carrier training cycles. New construction commissioning. It was not just the number of American ships. It was the number of American systems supporting those ships. By early 1943, Yamamoto himself demanded clarification. He had lived in America. He had seen American factories. He had seen American cars. He had seen American oil wells. He knew America was not Japan. He sent a cable demanding the intelligence division recalculate everything. They did. They pulled sighting reports, prisoner interrogations, captured manuals, radio intercept codes, logistics ship lists, crew rosters from debris recovery. When they finished the recalculation, the number they reached was over 850,000 personnel. And that was an understatement. With proper manning standards applied, it became 1.2 million, and that did not include training pipeline or shore, installations or support or depot units. It was at this point, intellectually, that the Japanese Navy should have panicked, but culture resisted. Admitting the true number meant admitting that the foundational war assumption, America cannot sustain two-front conflict, and had been false since before Pearl Harbor. And once a war assumption is exposed as false, the strategy that rests upon it collapses. Then came the captured radio operator off Kolombangara. He calmly told his interrogators. His boot camp processed 20,000. Recruits per month, 20,000 per month, 240,000 per year in one location. One location. Not the whole Navy. Not the whole training system. That one statement was the hammer that cracked the wall. And that is where part 1 ends, because this is the narrative midpoint we expand part 2 from. He remembered the smell. Burnt lacquer, cordite. Sea air soaked with aviation gas that should not have been in the air at all. But memory is cruel. Memory hides just enough to make the missing pieces hurt more. The average viewer of a war documentary thinks war is about explosions. It isn't. War is about the moments right before the explosion, when the world still looks normal, and human beings are still lying to themselves that the world is controllable, that someone can still salvage the moment, that someone can still fix this catastrophe before it becomes irreversible. Ozawa, by June 1944, was a man who understood he could not fix anything anymore, because the American industrial miracle had moved from power to overkill, and overkill was the one thing the Japanese Navy could never answer. That was the entire tragedy of Taiho in one sentence. She was designed to fight America at her weakest. She entered service when America was at her peak, and America never paused long enough to give Japan even the faintest mathematical chance to win. Aircraft carriers were not ships in the accepted pre-war sense. They were floating time machines. Whoever had more aircraft in the air earlier won. And America didn't just have more aircraft. America had more runways. Runways on ships, runways on islands, runways on sandbars, runways on captured coral reefs that Marines bled to secure. And every time a new runway was poured or bulldozed or carved out of jungle, the clock tilted more. You can measure Midway. You can measure Santa Cruz. You can measure Eastern Solomons. What you cannot measure is the rate at which America accelerated industrial output. That was the fatal curve, the curve that broke the mathematical spine of the Japanese plan. Taiho's disaster was not just a bomb. It was a pressure failure, a systems integration failure, a doctrinal blindness, a cultural refusal to accept leaks, literally and metaphorically. A gas leak is invisible until it is not. A strategic leak is invisible until it becomes a fireball, just like the ignition of vapors under Taiho's armored deck. The ignition of the entire Pacific War was invisible until suddenly it wasn't. Ozawa didn't lose one carrier that day. He lost the war's last argument, because the American industrial ecosystem, the system that turned cornfields into aluminum, teenagers into trained deck crews, Wisconsin forests into carrier decking, auto workers into turret fitters. That system had become a machine that produced victory whether individual American admirals were geniuses or not. One of the most underdocumented truths in Pacific historiography is this: the United States did not defeat Japan by brilliance. It defeated Japan by persistency, plus volume, a strategy that Japan literally did not even have the vocabulary to conceptualize. Because Japan was built on the belief that victory choppers precision. But mass is a form of precision that Japan never understood. 1,000,000 acceptable units outperform 100 perfect units. The United States fought like Ford Motor Company. Japan fought like a swordsmith. The Industrial Revolution was not kind to swordsmiths. Now here is the part most people still do not emotionally grasp. The U.S. could have won the Pacific War with just the Essex class. But they didn't stop there. They added Independence-class light carriers, converted cruiser hulls, rushed into war as if deadlines didn't exist. Then they added CVBs, Midway-class, supercarriers, planned while the war was still ongoing, because America wasn't planning to end the war. America was planning to dominate the post-war. Japan was planning to survive. America was planning to restructure the planet. Those are not the same strategic verb sets. One nation was counting months, the other nation was counting decades. Japanese strategy, stripped bare of mythology, was essentially a hope that America gets tired, America negotiates. America doesn't want to lose more ships, but America never valued ships the way Japan valued ships. Japan saw a carrier as a national soul, a sacred object, a culmination of steel and identity. America saw a carrier as a product. Products can be scrapped. Products can be replaced. Products can be duplicated. When a ship in the Pacific sank, the American reaction wasn't spiritual grief. It was procurement paperwork. A new hull number went on a chalkboard. More steel was diverted. More welders added shifts. And the solution wasn't sadness. The solution was overtime. We talk about battles like they were chess. They weren't chess, they were spreadsheets. Even in 1944, fleet numbers, sortie ratios, bombs dropped per 1,000 pounds of fuel delivered, per nautical mile of deck cycle time. These were math problems. And America solved math problems the way they solved car production problems. Volume production plus quality control, plus error tolerance, plus modular maintenance, plus continuous throughput. Japan didn't have throughput. Japan had faith. Faith doesn't reload aircraft. Faith doesn't refuel Hellcats. Faith doesn't machine turret rings. Faith doesn't build refineries. Faith doesn't refine avgas from Venezuelan crude across Panama canals. Faith cannot compete with supply chains. The pilots who launched from Taiho that morning, the men who believed they were going to write a final redemptive chapter, never understood the numbers curve they were flying into. They thought they were entering a battle. They were actually entering an industrial simulation. Every zero that took off had a story, a romantic arc, a soul. But the skies they were flying into had Hellcats, whose serial numbers were part of a continuous manufacturing run. And the pilots of those Hellcats were not mystical. They were measured, logged, tested, trained in standardized curricula, evaluated on kill ratios, replaced when killed. Because a system that values individuals over outcomes dies when the individual dies. A system that values throughput absorbs death like a cost line. And that is why Taiho, symbolically, had no future. Not because she lacked armor, but because Japan lacked replacement volume for everything she represented. This is the part of history documentaries that should be mandatory. War is not heroic. War is arithmetic. 6 months of shipbuilding versus 9 months. Carriers versus 17. And after 17, America stopped counting. Japan was counting carriers like holy relics. America was counting man-hours like factory managers. You cannot win against an enemy who treats your sacred objects as replaceable. You cannot win against an enemy who doesn't mourn machinery. You cannot win against an enemy who is not emotionally attached to the tools of victory. When Taiho exploded, it was not the sound of a carrier dying. It was the sound of an empire, realizing that the Industrial Revolution was not their religion. It was the sound of a nation hitting the brick wall of reality, the brick wall named mass production. The Pacific War did not end because Japan lacked courage. It ended because Japan lacked factories. That is why Ozawa on that deck, on that quiet morning, staring at that horizon, is one of the most tragic figures in naval history, because he was not a villain. He was a man who understood numbers too late, and by the time the fireball of vaporized aviation fuel engulfed the armored flight deck, the war was already over. The explosion was not the ending. The explosion was merely the moment of acceptance. Because history is cruel in the same way the sea is cruel, indifferent. And mass production is the most indifferent force humanity ever invented.